There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod. And for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some moles. Riding solo again today, as Stephen is dealing with some wonderful personal stuff on the side. I don't feel it's my job to report anything on that, so we'll leave Stephen to give you all the good news when he gets back. But a huge pleasure to have this investigative reporter, journalist on the podcast today. He wrote Rocky Mountain Massacre. He's been a investigative journalist for the Intercept for almost 10 years. This is Ryan Devereaux. Ryan, it's a huge pleasure to meet you. Like I was saying before, I read the article and I immediately said we have to get you on. So thanks for joining us from Tucson, Arizona. How's everything going today?
It's going well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Like I said, I've told you before, I listened to several episodes of the show while I was reporting this story. So I'm really happy to be here and speaking with you.
Yeah, 100%. What were the episodes, just out of curiosity, that you listened to while you were getting on this story and starting to do this piece?
Yeah, Dan McNulty, Dan Vermillion, Carter Niemeyer. There was a couple other ones, a couple other folks who weren't quoted in the story, but I listened to for context and background.
Nice. Yeah, and this is something that all of you out there who are listening to this episode, if you haven't read the article, please go over and read it. It's an incredibly well-researched, well-done piece by Ryan. I want to speak, though, Ryan, to your really the main focus of a lot of your reporting that I've seen is really a lot of political stuff at the border, covering policing. So you've had a lot of this background in that space. How did you just initially get started in journalism and moving into a space like that to really cover this stuff on a daily basis?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm a staff reporter at The Intercept, which is an investigative newsroom, nonprofit. It's based in New York City. And I've been based in New York City, had been based in New York City for most of my career. I've been doing this kind of work for about 13 years, and with the bulk of that at The Intercept. And as you sort of alluded to, I started out doing sort of investigative stuff around policing, a lot of that based in New York City with the NYPD. Kind of cut my teeth there. And then once The Intercept started up, I was the first reporter hired, and I covered a lot of national security, intelligence, operations, military operations, war on terror, types of stories, investigative projects. I did a lot of work around the drug war in Mexico, traveling to Mexico and doing investigative projects. Stateside, I reported on the FBI's investigations into the Bundy family, the ranchers who had a couple of standoffs with the federal government in recent years. And then in the last several years, particularly under the Trump administration, was doing a lot of work around the border, specifically here in southern Arizona, focusing on the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol, and investigations into humanitarian aid groups here that were putting water out in the desert and providing, doing search and recovery work here that were hit with a number of federal investigations, trials, and that sort of work actually kind of played a part in my relocating down here to the desert. I kind of fell in love with the region. So my work has largely focused on issues around state violence, federal investigations, law enforcement agencies, which turned out to be kind of helpful as a background in working on this project, which is a bit far afield from some of the things that I've covered in the past, but also contains some of the same elements. And a lot of the principles in doing investigative journalism kind of remain the same.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because it's so fascinating to look at the background of your work as a whole and the pieces that you've written and the topics that you cover. And it does seem slightly out of bounds for what you're normally doing. But touch on that, because we've done many podcasts about this specific issue, about the wolf hunt that just happened in Montana, and the persecution of wolves in the Northern Rockies in terms of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. So with your background, what are some of the things that you brought to the table when, first of all, how did you find out about and wanted to do a piece like this, and what tools did you use from your past experiences to bring into researching it and eventually doing this article?
Yeah. So while I'm an investigative reporter in my professional life, in my just personal civilian life, I've been going to Yellowstone for years, camping in Yellowstone, backcountry hiking in Yellowstone. My sort of interest in sort of research as a kid sort of started with just obsessively being interested in animals, including wolves. So, Yellowstone, the reintroduction, that entire history, Northern Yellowstone specifically, I've spent most of my time when I'm there in the park in Slough Creek, Lamar Valley, like northern parts of the park. So I would, obsessively watched plenty of documentaries on the reintroduction and that sort of thing. So, I knew this history generally. I was actually camping in Yellowstone at the end of last summer, a month before the hunt started, in the Slough Creek, Lamar Valley area, and watching some wolves as part of that trip. So, those issues were on my mind, or at least wolves were on my mind a bit when the hunt started. And then as it started picking up, I was keeping an eye on stories and kind of following it, interested to see how things went. By around December, you may remember there were dozens of, kind of veteran wildlife managers from Montana wrote an open essay letter sort of excoriating Governor Greg Gianforte's administration for its handling of wolves and grizzlies, basically their predator management policies, and arguing that the governor was attempting through his game commission to return the state to the 1880s. And that idea, an argument, and that it was coming from so many people with such an extensive history in the region, really caught my attention. So I just started, doing a lot of reading and started calling some of the people that were on that list, and trying to get a sense of what was going on, how things had changed, how wildlife management had worked in the state before the governor's election in 2020, and why people were so alarmed now. And so it really started as a kind of political story about how this change in leadership in the governor's office in Montana manifested in southwestern Montana and in the context of hunting Yellowstone's wolves.
So when you're doing this research and you're talking to, again, some of the individuals we've had on the podcast, the Dan Vermillions of the world, Carter Niemeyer, what was the sense that you got from some of these figures of why? Is it just as simple, and we've asked this question a bunch of times, was it just as simple as Governor Gianforte being elected and sweeping away a lot of these quotas and these protections essentially for the wolves in and surrounding the park, or is it deeper than that? What did you find out in that vein?
Yeah, I certainly think it's deeper than that. I mean, that's a huge, a critical and essential part of this story, a sort of turning point, a moment when things shift. But the thing that I kept hearing from folks who have kind of devoted their lives to these issues professionally for decades is this argument that there was a pendulum swing effect in Montana specifically. Montana had, the way it was described to me, sort of stood out from the other northern Rocky states, Wyoming and Idaho, and really developed this reputation over the years post reintroduction in 1995 as a sort of leader in nonpartisan, science-driven wildlife management. And people were really proud of that. And this is why they were so upset and appalled at what was happening. What was continually described to me is a sort of hunt that was driven not by science, but as a sort of deep-seated, festering desire to stick it to the groups and interests and actors who, pushed the reintroduction, who in the decade, 2.5 decades after the reintroduction sort of garnered a lot of praise for their work. It really seemed in the eyes of people who've lived this work for a long time, like this was motivated by feelings of retribution and revenge. I mean, that was very much Carter Niemeyer's opinion when I spoke to him, but he was far from the only person who expressed that to me. I mean, I heard it over and over again with just about everybody I spoke to with a background in Montana and wolves in the region. And I found that very interesting.
I mean, when we're talking about, because I've spoken with some of the biologists there before, during, after, and the mood there really seemed to shift, obviously, while this was happening, after it was happening, and you're going to do your winter studies. And the research that these individuals, these groups of people have done is essentially wiped off the face of the planet, because when you lose a pack or members of a pack and a pack splits, all of that data, not that it's rendered useless or not valuable, you almost have to start from scratch. And so when you're talking to those individuals, other than disappointment and being upset, what are the ramifications scientifically that you saw from these people that you're talking with?
Yeah, so I did an interview early in the reporting process with Doug Smith, the head of Yellowstone's Wolf Project, on the sort of the face of the project for virtually its entire existence. And one of the points that he stressed to me that I found most striking in our conversation was that, what made Yellowstone's project so special was that you had this unexploited population. You had this population of wolves that didn't experience the kind of levels of human-caused mortality that you see in virtually every other wolf population in the world. So you just had this unparalleled, unmatched population that could be observed closely. If you've been to, I'm sure many people who are listening to this podcast have been to Yellowstone. You can actually watch wolves doing wolf things, and that's great for tourists and stuff. But for scientists, for biologists, it was just an incredible resource, and they were able to track the way that wolves impacted the ecosystem over 2.5 decades. It just wasn't the kind of population that existed anywhere else. It was truly unique. These wolves that ended up being killed during the hunt last year, I mean, they spend 96% of their time in the park. It was just an extraordinarily unique population. And that was the basis, one strut of the arguments for, having buffers north of the park and quotas and that sort of thing, was just that these wolves are different. There's something special about this. And the folks on the other side argue that we shouldn't be treating these animals as special and different. They are animals. We should treat them like every other species. But that was for a lot of the biologists and researchers, that was the sort of core frustration and disappointment in what happened last year, is that, this kind of population, this kind of work that was unmatched anywhere else was just gone. The fundamental nature of the kind of wolves and wolf activity that you're looking at was disrupted and changed, and it will take some time for things to go back to the way they were.
Right. With that too, and sort of pairing this with the political ideology, what did you as an investigative journalist find out from, because I'm imagining you spent a good period of time in these small towns and the Bozeman's and places in the northern part of Yellowstone. What was the feeling you were getting in the surrounding community, or even maybe on the political side, of how this was either festering? Was it coming out? Were there blatant displays of individuals being upset or happy that the quotas were lifted? How were you able to read the situation from that standpoint? Because you do deal with a lot of political one side versus the other in a lot of your other pieces. So how did this stack up in that vein as you were doing this as well?
My philosophy and my approach with stories generally is that all stories are fundamentally local stories. So stories happen in a place. Places are populated by people often who've been there for some time. I've found it instructive, useful to actually go to the places that I'm writing about and spend some time and talk to people, because what you just come away with a deeper understanding that you don't get if you're trying to do this kind of work from afar. What I found in the case of this story and what was going on in Yellowstone's northern border, especially in the context of a small town of Gardner, just the sort of northern gateway to the park, and even smaller community of Jardine, just above Gardner, is a number of individuals on both sides of this sort of conflict who've been around for a long, long time. In a number of cases, in the sort of outfitting community, families who have been there essentially, going back 100 years or more since basically settlers arrived in the region, and then a number of other folks who've been involved in this conflict, this struggle, whatever you want to call it, since the reintroduction. So then people know each other, and people know each other's politics, and there are outspoken members on both sides in the community, and people see each other going about their daily lives. So it is a very intensely local. There were intense local effects to what happened last year, and I was sort of struck by, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, by the sort of reticence and level of fear that some folks I spoke to had about using their names in stories and the consequences that they would experience locally. And because these are very heated issues. We're talking about an industry, if you want to call it that generates tens of millions. There was a study recently that estimated the amount of money generated from wolf watching in Yellowstone around $82 billion a year. I mean, there's a lot of money involved. There's also, on the other side, some really, really deep-seated beliefs that the past 2.5 decades post-reintroduction have been a continual attack on heritage and culture. And, there's a lot going on there. It goes very deep, and people feel very intensely about this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the history behind this, because we, again, have discussed the heritage of the individuals that have moved across this country, that settled here in the West. They've had ranches for generations out there, maybe mostly cattle. I don't know if there's too much sheep out there, and I should know this, but I off the top of my head, not really. What's the impact, or what are some of these deep-seated issues that you are seeing from that side of it? Because we do believe that the ranching community, they should have a voice in a lot of some of what's going on, because they are really these gatekeepers of these Western states that keep this land alive to a degree, because if they're not there, essentially, I'm sure some either bodies of people, companies will come in, develop this land, and then we don't have the Yellowstone, or we don't have, the Teton, anything that would be considered wild. So what are the arguments from that side that they told you, and what did you find out? Did it correlate? Did it line up? Was it parallel, or was it different from what you saw from that end?
In this particular region, we're talking about 2 hunting districts that are a very comparatively small sliver of Southwest Montana, and really one district where the vast majority of this hunt took place. It's known as wolf management, or was. There's been some changes proposed for the coming season. 313. So it's not heavy duty ranching land in the way that other parts of Montana and the Rocky Mountain West are. The sort of, if you want to call it anti-wolf side, though they wouldn't, I think, describe themselves that way, that exists in this area are outfitters, hunting outfitters, backcountry hunting guides who have been in the region in many cases, like I said, for generations, and whose principal argument with respect to wolves is related to the predation of elk. And you guys have talked about this in the show.
Right.
It's like a huge thing, and its own subject that we could talk about for days. But that is the sort of core constituency that has been agitating for liberalization of wolf hunting in that region is outfitters, and outfitters often with generational ties to the land. And when I think about where the opposition comes from and sort of how they're looking at things, I can't help but think about some of the other reporting that I've done related to the West and related to the American right. So I think, we talked a little bit about how, I was initially interested in this because of this idea that, from veteran wildlife managers, that what was happening in this region was taking Montana back to the 1880s. So I want to just talk briefly about the history here and how I think it might be an answer to the question you were asking.
Yeah, we need context. Go ahead. Absolutely.
So you have this push west and this mass removal of predators from the landscape, and a particularly aggressive manifestation in the case of wolves. And you get to the 1920s, and by that point, the federal government's involved, and in Yellowstone, rangers are systematically removing wolves from the landscape. And in the case of a number of these families that are there in Southwest Yellowstone today, they have ancestors and relatives who were part of that effort, either contractors or paid to remove wolves from the land. That was their background and history. And then you get to the 1960s and the new sort of environmental movement springing up across the country. There's this idea that nature has an intrinsic value, that it's not just valuable for what we can take from it. Sort of reimagining, in some cases borrowing from the indigenous cultures who already understood these things, but a changing perspective on our relationship with the land and wildlife, which culminates in the Endangered Species Act, a decade later, of which, wolves are right there at the top of the list, right there at the beginning as this they are this sort of symbol of this change in thinking, and this multi-decade process unfolds, as everybody who's listening to this is probably aware of, that leads to the reintroduction in 95. I think a lot of that, for the general audience, is broadly seen as a success story that everybody was happy about and welcomed. But that wasn't actually the case in the West. The Endangered Species Act was highly controversial among a lot of constituencies throughout the region. It continues to be today, and the way the reintroduction manifested, especially by the time we get to the 1990s, and you have to understand that the mid-90s in the Rocky Mountain West were so intensely political period of time. There were, militias in Montana. There was, one of the most infamous standoffs with the federal government in Montana in the early 90s. This was a period of really intense right-wing backlash to the federal government, and a lot of that activity was concentrated in the Rocky Mountain West. And that's not to say that everybody who was opposed to wolf reintroduction was some sort of armed right-wing extremist, but these were the kind of sentiments that existed during that time period. And you had the Clinton administration, arguably probably the most loathed political family among the American right, coming in and saying we're going to initiate this big federal program to reintroduce a species that your grandparents were paid to remove from here that you don't want here. That's gonna generate some hostility, and you have people like Ted Turner and all these celebrities getting involved in wolf reintroduction in the mid-90s for a segment of the population there in the West. This whole thing looked and felt like almost like a caricature of their worst nightmares, right? It's not, and that those sorts of sentiments hung around, I think, for 25 years. You had Montana garnering this reputation among biologists for its professionalism and its nonpartisan, science-driven wildlife management. And by the time the 25-year anniversary of the wolf reintroduction comes around in 2020, there's like a real feeling among folks who worked on that initiative of success and triumph. But the political leadership in Montana is changing at that very moment, and that kind of gets us to where we were last year with the hunt. 2.5 decades of frustration and resentment. Now having an outlet.
Right. It's fascinating that I don't know if fascinating is the right word, but it's good to get the background so that I think people understand where some of the opposing opinions come from, some of where, as you say, it really, it's amazing. The more we talk about this story particularly, you really come to find out, it really is a people issue, people problem, because the animals are just there trying to live on the landscape. Obviously, if we want to even just take the Yellowstone wolves aside from this conversation, I know it's about the Yellowstone wolves, but they're almost a different section of the wolf population. And it seems as though, like you said, with the Endangered Species Act, you're looking at the wolf at the very top of that list. They're the symbol of all endangered species that are here in the United States. So in a way, it seems as though that correlates to the Yellowstone wolves being these cornerstone packs of this species that were now brought back to these states, to these territories and areas, and saying, if we can hurt this, obviously the wolves in Idaho, the Wisconsin, Minnesota, all over the place. Again, there's different political leanings, different ways that they're managed. But as you say, it's almost a different caricature because they're so different in the way that they have been brought here, evolved.
They're so symbolic.
And symbolic, absolutely. Yes, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, on that.
The way I kind of think of it is I'm not sure that there is a strip of land, a sort of more politically contested and symbolic than that region just north of the park that those wolves cross, right? It's very interesting if you look at the way Montana's hunt unfolded last year. The legislation called for killing at least 450 wolves, and then sort of assessing where things were, maybe killing some more after that. But the season ended with 273 wolves killed, but there was a disproportionate number in that specific place,
right? In that hunting region,
in that one district, that this politically significant district where folks have been denied access to that population of wolves. We didn't see, even though all of these new measures were passed, giving hunters and trappers many more tools and ways to hunt wolves, an explosion in interest in hunting wolves across the state, everywhere. What we did see, however, it was in this significant small geographic area, an intense level of activity, which I think it could be expected. It could have been anticipated. Maybe, I mean, I did speak to at length with one of the FWP commissioners who was a holdover from the previous administration, but I wasn't able to speak to some of the others. But I do think that this sort of explosive level of killing in this geographic area should have been foreseeable for anyone with a sort of understanding of the history of the reintroduction and the sentiments that exist around it in that particular area of Southwest Montana.
Did you see anything, I think, and I'm not quoting anyone particularly, but I believe I've heard this somewhere, that really, and it's an interesting point that you brought up just before about that the interest in hunting wolves did not go up, but it seems as though there are certain groups or individuals that are very good at doing this particular hunting, and that's where the majority of wolves were taken were mostly by certain groups and certain individuals, and that it wasn't, like you say, someone buying a wolf tag in, let's say, Illinois, driving to Montana. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't seem like that was the case. Am I wrong in that, or did you find that out at all?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, of all the different districts and regions in Montana, I should say, like, Southwest Montana didn't have the most wolves killed. It had a disproportionate number of wolves killed for the estimated population of that region. Right. Northwest Montana, which also had quotas outside Glacier, actually had more overall wolves killed.
Correct.
But to your point, and actually, this was a point that Dan Vermillion brought up when I spoke to him, and he was a FWP commissioner for Southwest Montana prior to the Gianforte administration. We were talking about. I was asking him about this sort of creation of these wolf hunting quotas in these two regions, and he described it, as many other people sort of stressed in my reporting, that this was a story of compromises that were made and, trying to, get both sides to sort of an agreeable an agreement on how things should be managed with this specific population in this specific little area. And one of the points that he made was that in that area, there are some very, very capable, effective, and highly motivated wolf hunters and trappers who, without some sort of restrictions in place, could take a sizable chunk out of Yellowstone's wolf population over the course of a season. And so, that was one of the things that motivated the effort to have quotas in that region, which were down to one wolf per hunting district in these two hunting districts, so 2 wolves total at the beginning of the Gianforte administration, and then those quotas were eliminated entirely, and there were none. And then, as Dan Vermillion sort of suggested, the motivated, effective wolf hunting and trapping community of that region of the state responded as one would expect, and took a lot of wolves in that area over a very short period of time.
Right. What's the ultimate end? Because you did speak to outfitters. What's the ultimate goal or end for individuals that are looking to hunt wolves? Because it's not as though it's an ungulate like an elk or a deer or a bison in that way, is that the meat can be used for feeding, to supply. If I can understand subsistence hunting with individuals that we're hunting elk or deer for our family to eat for the winter, for whatever the year is. What are the motivations other than what I think we've all heard sort of said verbatim that, myths and legends, wolves are diabolical creatures. They're going to hunt humans if they're let to roam free. All the things that we normally hear. Did you find anything different of what the reasonings are, or was it basically status quo in that arena?
I would say basically status quo. I mean, there's one argument that you will hear is that there is a particular challenge to hunting wolves. Specifically, they're very difficult to hunt. They're hard to track. It's a real achievement to get a wolf. That's understandable to a degree, but not so much in the context of the hunt that we're talking about in this area of Southwest Montana, where what was described to me by people who witnessed how the hunt unfolded was basically road hunting from overlooks onto the park's border, where you could watch wolves come out, wolves that spend 96% of their time in a park where they are watched by people with scopes every day and don't have this sort of ingrained fear that a wolf, that you're hunting elsewhere in Montana, right, might have. So I'm not sure that this sort of argument that it is, a unique kind of extraordinarily challenging hunt really applies in the case of the way things went down north of the park. It just doesn't jive with what we know about where wolves were taken and what we know about the way the conduct of the hunt unfolded. And so the other argument that you hear a lot is the elk predation argument, which is essentially that, I'm an outfitter. I've been in this area. My family's been in this area for generations. I remember the days when elk were coming out of the park in massive numbers. And, these would be boom times for outfitters who are, taking people out to hunt elk. And yeah, the populations have changed. Their migration patterns have changed. And giving that argument the benefit of the doubt, I could understand how it's possible that access isn't what it used to be. But you're also, in talking about that time period, you're talking about a time period where wolves and also grizzlies and
lions
and mountain lions were essentially completely gone. The ecosystem wasn't as healthy as it is today. But those are the kind of arguments that I've encountered the most in this reporting.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I want to ask you too, if we see these changing patterns, and listen, I don't profess to know what it's like to be an outfitter or run a business like that, so I am not making any judgments here. Is there any sort of evolutionary change that is trying to happen in that way, to understand that obviously, as we've said, the ecosystem is probably healthier than it's ever been, at least over the course of the last, let's say, century. We can probably relatively, with good conscience, say that the ecosystem in and around Yellowstone is fairly healthy, with all the apex predators there, and lions and grizzlies and wolves. The elk numbers are strong. The elk themselves are stronger and healthier. Is there any thought or any sort of movement for these individuals that you spoke to changing their practices and maybe trying to move with the elk, and understanding that maybe, and again, I understand you're trying to make a living. That's not the point I'm trying to make. Is there any adjustment that's happening, or is it simply we need to eliminate, otherwise our business goes under?
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation to have, and a really complex conversation to have, because I tend to agree with you. I don't know what it's like to run one of these businesses, and I can, imagine the frustrations that people describe that they're having. One of the issues that seems to me to be, a component of the kind of problems that we're talking about here, and that I encountered throughout my reporting, was that you have a lot of elk moving onto private lands, large privately held stretches of land that public lands hunters have really struggled, local resident Montana hunters struggle to get access to. And, you have a dynamic in which these lands are oftentimes accessible if you'll pay certain outfitters who work with high dollar out of state hunters. You can get to them if you're one of those guys, basically. So I think that there's a conversation to be had about how those dynamics are playing out, and how public lands access to elk is changing. And you do hear that kind of critique and that kind of conversation happening in some hunting quarters.
I want to jump to the title, really the subtitle, to the article as well, because it really caught my attention. So it's called Rocky Mountain Massacre, but I don't know if it's the tag or how you would put it. So if I mess that up, just remind me. But you posed the question: was Yellowstone's deadliest wolf hunt in 100 years an inside job? Does this really feed into the politics that we spoke about earlier, or is it deeper than that? Because there is a portion in there that I was reading about a park ranger. I believe it's a current park ranger or a former park ranger. Remind me if that's the case.
No longer retired.
Okay. So retired park ranger
was current at the time of the hunt. Retired immediately after
the hunt. Okay. So dive into this portion of the story, because it says this individual feels like it was a witch hunt on maybe them in particular, but maybe on individuals who hunt wolves in general. What was the feeling behind really to pose that question at the top of the article, and then really dive into this specific aspect of it and what it really means for the overall scope of the story itself?
So I want to be real careful and clear about what we found and what we what we lay out here in this portion of the story. It wasn't something that I was expecting to encounter in the reporting. I set out, as I said, to sort of do about a story about the politics of all of this. But I was always very interested also in the conduct of the hunt, how it actually unfolded. So I was always sort of poking around to try to understand that component. And in the course of the reporting, I learned that the last Yellowstone wolf to die in the course of this hunt was a collared wolf that was killed on January 30th, known as 1233 among the park researchers, and that the wolf was killed by a veteran backcountry ranger named Brian Helms, who had been working in Yellowstone for decades. For folks who are familiar with the reintroduction story, when wolves were first brought into the park in 1995, there were so many threats coming in against them that guards were posted in sort of hunting blinds, hidden in the trees around the enclosures that the wolves were brought to. And Helms was, in fact, one of these guys who was out there guarding the wolves when they were first reintroduced. So he's been there for a long time, and his area of responsibility is the northern border of Yellowstone, right in that sort of Gardner area. So he is deeply, deeply familiar with that area of the park. And he agreed to speak to me for this story about his decision to hunt this wolf, and how it played out, and the what happened afterwards. And what he described to me was that this wasn't the first Yellowstone wolf that he had killed. There was another on the park border a few years back, but he believes that this one turned into an issue for him because it was a collared wolf. Thus, it was part of Yellowstone's wolf research program. He told me that he was on shift, saw wolves on the edge of the park, had previously purchased a wolf hunting license. I have every FWP, the Montana Fish Wildlife Parks wolf registration form from last year, all 73 of them for all of the wolves that were harvested, including this one. So, I've had already some documentary evidence that this particular hunt existed, that this hunt had happened. The identity of the hunter is redacted, but I managed to confirm that it was Helms. He said that he saw these wolves out there near the edge of the park, had his license, which the FWP registration form indicated was true. After work, met up with a local outfitter named Ryan Counts, who's one of these folks whose family has been in the area for generations. He has been in news stories before related to his view on Yellowstone wolves, his view that wolf hunting north of the park should be liberalized, and in 2020 had posted a photo on his Facebook of two wolves that had been killed, laid out in front of a Trump 2020 sign. So the backcountry ranger Helms meets up with Counts. They spot this wolf, according to Helms, just outside the park boundary. And again, this is a guy who his whole job is to really understand where that boundary lies. So he says, I know better than anyone where that boundary is. And this wolf was outside of that boundary. There's also a sort of hunting hours end at a specific time in Montana, and they change day to day. And that day it was, I believe, 5:59. He told me that he double checked before he took his shot that he was within the legal window. Some minutes before, he said, killed this wolf. And he said, didn't realize that it was collared until he walked up to it. He was living in Yellowstone at the time as being an employee. He didn't have the sort of paperwork that would allow him to take this wolf and its collar back into the park where he lived. So his hunting partner Counts offered to take the wolf and the collar for him to his property inside the park. Basically, that meant that park employees would see that the collar was turning up at the property, was showing itself at the property of a very well-known local wolf hunter, and there would be an assumption that, okay, one of our wolves in the research program has been killed. It's at Counts' property. We need to get the collar back. So that basically sets in motion a series of events where the state game warden comes out, inspects the kill site, and Yellowstone is trying to determine what happened. They eventually discover that, because the state game warden looked into this, they knew who had taken the wolf. Then Yellowstone learns who had taken the wolf, that it's one of their employees. And Helms, according to his version of events, was very soon after he got this wolf, things started, in the way that he describes it, unraveling for him. He was accused, he says, by one of the top Yellowstone law enforcement officials of being part of what he described as a conspiracy involving other park rangers, other Yellowstone law enforcement rangers, to share location information on collared wolves with hunters who were waiting outside the park. Helms said that this accusation was entirely baseless, completely untrue, that he felt that he was targeted in a witch hunt because he had exercised his legal right to participate in a wolf hunt that, that he had every right to do. In his view, he, as soon as that wolf crossed out of the park boundaries, and as soon as he was not on shift and not working, he had every right to take that wolf. And immediately after he was told of these allegations against him, he decided to retire that day. And I, reached out, obviously, to Yellowstone and the National Park Service. I filed public information requests about this, and had ongoing correspondence with FWP, Montana's state game agency, to try to understand what happened here. I was given through a public information request a substantial investigative file related to this incident, nearly 300 pages long and almost entirely redacted, so blacked out. It's clear that the Park Service, their Office of Professional Responsibility, did open a large, seemingly large investigation into this incident. Yellowstone, in their statement to me, said that they determined that the wolf was not killed in the park. In the investigative file that I received, that there were just a couple bits of information that weren't redacted, a couple of maps, and one of them said that the events of the hunt began in the park and ended outside of the park, and also indicated that the wolf was killed at or around 6:15, which would be after the hunting window closed. But again, that what we know is, as far as we know, Helms was not charged with any crimes. He's not accused by his former employer of having killed a wolf inside the park. What Yellowstone did tell me, though, is that there is an ongoing investigation related to these issues, and they declined to comment on what Helms said regarding the alleged wolf killing conspiracy that he says is baseless. Separately, Montana's Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, FWP, told me that they have an ongoing investigation into this incident that is being led by, or has been, I don't know what its status is at this moment, but as of publication, was being led by their Special Investigations Office out of Helena, so out of the capital. So that is broadly what I discovered about how the final, Yellowstone wolf to die was killed. And obviously, within the park, this was known among some park employees, but it was a pretty closely held piece of information. Obviously, extremely controversial. Even if there's no laws or internal park rules broken, it was a big deal inside the park, and people have pretty strong feelings about it.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'm processing myself about you as you go through that story. Is there going to be are you going to be following up? Because I know before we scheduled this conversation, this podcast, you were already slammed this week with obviously follow-up reporting. I think not only on this story, but other stories. Do you feel like there's going to be a follow-up to your original piece in talking about not just this, but I guess the fallout of what's happening?
Yeah, I'm absolutely actively engaged in follow-up reporting. I don't know where it'll lead me. I didn't expect the previous round of reporting to lead where it did. Very interested in the status, scope, and contours of this investigation. These investigations, I should say, the state and federal investigations. I'm interested in whether Helms' claim that this was a witch hunt has merit or not. I'm interested in what authorities are looking into. So I'm absolutely actively still reporting on this, and I'm also interested in the sort of all of this is unfolding at the same moment that FWS Fish Wildlife Service is conducting and should be wrapping up this year-long review to determine whether wolves in the Northern Rockies should be relisted under the Endangered Species Act. So there's, which would be, for all of the reasons that we already discussed, politically significant development should it happen. I mean, I think either way, whether it happens or doesn't happen, you're going to have some very upset people on
either side.
Either way.
Yeah.
So there's and that review was sort of launched in response to a petition that was filed by environmental groups that were responding directly to the nature of the hunts in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. So these things are all related, and I think that there's still a lot that's happening.
Did you think it was going to be this deep of a story when you first initially got it? Because you went from camping in Yellowstone, hearing about what's going on, and then you're diving into this really multi-layered situation. Again, you've done plenty of work where there are, going in, there's multi-layers and multi-tiers. Was this something that you were prepared for? Obviously, prepared to see that it was this deep, or did it surprise you in that way?
It was shocking, honestly. I didn't expect it to evolve the way that it did. I've done a lot of this type of work, a lot of investigative reporting over the years, and the way that this one unfolded and seemed to just go deeper and deeper was really unique. The one thing I do want to touch on really quickly, that we've really started to get into this when we've spoken to anyone from Montana or these surrounding areas, is really the economic impact. Not only for, the businesses, we're talking about the restaurants, the outfitters, the people who rent the scopes and things like that, but really the overall economic picture of Montana in general. And you spoke about this earlier, that we're talking tens of millions of dollars, somewhere upwards in the $80 million range, that ecotourism is really starting to have as a huge portion of Montana's income. Where does this leave the state, in your opinion, that you've found in terms of wildlife management, ecotourism, and all of these businesses really wrapped up in something that is beneficial for, if it's done correctly, can really benefit everyone? Where do you think that portion of it sits currently? Yeah, it's a huge question, and an issue that a lot of the folks that I spoke to who are involved in ecotourism or wolf watching, that sort of thing, in that Southwest Montana area are hyper concerned about. Their livelihoods are sort of built around this industry. It's interesting academic work that's been done. I believe Colorado State University has looked at some of these issues of sort of how perceptions of wildlife and the value of wildlife has changed over the years. And there's sort of the large number of Americans who spend money every year to go see wildlife somewhere. Many are birders, but often, many people go to Yellowstone to see wolves.
And even individuals worldwide, I'm sure you've seen that in the many times you've been there, that it's not just because it's specifically Yellowstone, but North America in general is it's lucky right now to have these places, because there are people around the globe that don't have a place where they can literally drive into and see all this wildlife just literally right there. I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's such a fascinating point to drive home. Yeah.
And we're talking about a state where the current governor ran on creating jobs and ran on economic issues. Montana, there's real poverty in Montana. There's people who struggle. And here you have an industry that exists that is generating tens of millions of dollars a year that deeply matters to the people that are involved in it. And as you say, of bringing in folks from across the world every year. There are a lot of bound up economic issues in everything that we're describing here. And there's, it's probably a conversation for another podcast, but this entire situation leads into another conversation about state wildlife management, where state wildlife management agencies get their money, and the sort of different values and perspectives that state game agencies sometimes have versus federal agencies, and there's millions and millions and millions of dollars that flow into those state level agencies via the purchase of guns, ammo, tackle gear that are connected to a kind of different approach to wildlife than the sort of ecotourism that we're describing. So it's all very connected and complicated, and people have really strong feelings about it.
Ryan, just talk about too, as we wrap up a little bit, just your overall feelings about the hunt in general, what you found out. Did it seem like this leaned, were there some ethical parts to it, or did it mostly lean towards the unethical end of hunting, or what people would consider an ethical hunt? Because you come from a hunting family, as you've described to me, and I know individuals who hunt ethically. Where did this stand on that line in your reporting that you found?
Yeah, so I'll answer that by going back to a hearing that was held in Montana before the hunt started. It was the FWP, Fish Wildlife Parks commissioners were meeting to sort of hash out how this would unfold. And one of the commissioners, Pat Byworth, who was the only commissioner remaining from the previous administration prior to Gianforte, he was commenting on the proposal to include things in the hunt, like night hunting with night vision goggles and bright lights to disorient wolves, snares, aerial hunting, baiting, using bait to draw wolves, for example, out of Yellowstone onto lands where they could be killed. He made this point that these are the kinds of things that game wardens traditionally open investigations for, and not the kind of thing that a professional game commission should legalize or endorse. He argued that by taking those kinds of steps, Montana could risk losing its authority to manage wolves altogether, that the feds could step in. And we're all already seeing the sort of potential wisdom in what Byers was describing there, because the feds are conducting this status review right now to determine whether or not wolves in Montana should be returned to the endangered species list. When the hunt itself actually unfolded in the way that it unfolded, there is, if you search for it hard enough, you can find wolf hunting Instagram. It's a thing, and as this hunt was unfolding north of Yellowstone, there was a sort of celebratory feel among that community. There, I saw pictures of hunters with the wolves that they killed tagging Yellowstone National Park in their posts. There were, there's one person I spoke to in the story, comes up at the end. His name is Ralph Johnson, and he was a lifetime outfitter right there. His family has been outfitting just north of the park his entire life. Their family business goes back almost 100 years, and he regularly hikes that area. And he would watch the way that this hunt was unfolding north of the park. There's an area known as Deckard Flats. It's kind of like open area that it's right on the park's boundary. It's where a number of wolves were killed in that area, park wolves. And then, hunters would gather at dawn and dusk with their electronic predator calls to try to lure wolves out. He said that he saw folks using cell phones, hunters using cell phones to communicate while they were out there. And that would be a violation of Montana's hunting regulations. I asked FWP if they had heard any complaints about that in that area. They did say that they received complaints, but they never substantiated any or brought any charges. But for, folks who were close to this, there was a feeling that this hunt crossed the line from being a hunt into something else, something that had a different flavor and feel to it.
A different feel, yeah, for sure. And yeah, just speak briefly about Ralph though too, because it was a positive. It seemed like a positive light in the part of this story that he comes, like you said, comes from an outfitting family, but really was on the opposite side of what you just described, of what he was not only seeing, but what he was saying to you and really saying to those that were engaging in these type of acts.
Yeah. Ralph Johnson is a really fascinating figure who I encountered through my reporting. I met up with him up at his place just north of the park's boundaries. His father started the family outfitting business almost 100 years ago. So, not long after Yellowstone was first opened, probably around the time when it was still being managed by the Army. And so he, has lived his whole life with the wolf issue. He was there in the days when wolves were gone from the landscape and when elk were, streaming out of the park in huge numbers and hunters could gather in these firing lines north of the park and just shoot them down. He remembers that. He was there through the reintroduction in 95 and everything that came after, and the sort of evolution of perspectives among his fellow outfitters on the elk predation issue, on the impact that wolves had on the elk population. And he has a brother who's also a outfitter just down the road. And his brother's company has acknowledged that they had some clients who participated in last year's hunt. His brother has been very, very outspoken over the years about the Yellowstone Wolf Reintroduction Program, and highly critical and strong supporter of liberalizing wolf hunting methods in that region. So Ralph takes the opposite view, actually believes that wolf hunting should be shut down in that region. We spoke for a long time about his perspective on the state, its history, how it changed under Governor Gianforte, and his sort of view that what's been going on and what happened last year in particular was disturbing and upsetting because it reflected a small minority of individuals asserting their dominance over this region that is national forest land, is open to everybody, and intimidating people and acting as though that space was theirs and theirs alone. And he registered his deeply held opposition to that view and argued that what people need to have in this moment is sort of courage to stand up to those interests and to those folks who would seek to dominate the region.
I couldn't honestly think of, after again meeting you finally and having this conversation, I really couldn't think of a better individual with the background that you have to really tackle this story and really dive into all the layers of what this is actually, who it's affecting, what it's affecting, and bringing a story like this to light and diving into it. So from my perspective, I can't thank you enough for the work you've already done. And I know there's going to be more work for you in the future. I mean, I was going to ask what you think it's to come, but you already have said that clearly there's follow-up and there's going to be other articles and other stories that really that really come out from all of this that you've already done.
Well, I thank you guys for having this fantastic podcast. It was just like I said, an enormously valuable resource for me while I was doing reporting. I'm glad you bring all these folks on to talk. I hope you could get, it'd be awesome if you could get some of these, outfitter guys that I've spoken to on. I know that would be difficult, but there are just so many issues, so many perspectives on this. And I really appreciate y'all taking the time to have me on.
Of course. And, the last thing I'll ask you, Ryan, before because I want to promote the article, your Twitter handle, where people can see the rest of your stuff. My last question is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I mean, it's probably pretty cliche, but wild. I mean, it obviously, I came of age during this period in which the reintroduction was happening, grew up, just south of the Wyoming border. And it's hard not to associate wolves and wild together anytime I hear that word.
Yeah, I agree with you. So tell everybody where I'm going to have the article in the description. So everybody who's listening, if you haven't read it already, I'm going to post on our socials, but also have it in the description. Where can they go, Ryan, to see the rest of your work? Tell them about the Intercept and also how to find you on Twitter as well. Yep.
The website is theintercept.com, and you can find me on Twitter at @rdevereaux. That's RDEVRO.
Awesome. Ryan Devereaux, this was a very informative discussion. I plan to have you on again. Anytime you have follow-up stuff, reach out to me. Hopefully Stephen will be here for the next conversation, but this was extremely informative. People, go read the article. It's at The Intercept, Rocky Mountain Massacre. Ryan Devereaux, thank you so much, my friend. It was a pleasure meeting you, and stick around for a few minutes after. I got a couple more things to ask you, but thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation and doing the work. Really appreciate it. No problem. How's to all out there, and Stephen and I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.